So with that, I have the distinguished honor to present our Sandoz Scholar of this last year, Broc Anderson. The Sandoz Board and Scholars Committee are pleased to honor Broc. He's originally from Alliance, Nebraska, and found a niche for Nebraska history early on. In 2017, he graduated from Chadron State College with his bachelor's in social science education and taught at Gordon Rushville High School for 1 year. Broc then continued his education at the University of Nebraska-Kearney, and now near the end of his master's thesis that focused on borderland history of the Nebraska Panhandle to the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. Since August 2019, Broc has been at the Buffalo County Historical Society Trails and Rails Museum as the Community Engagement Director in organizing events, fundraisers, and many other museum-related duties. With that, I'll welcome Broc. I'll let you get to it.
Okay. Can everyone hear me? Perfect. Okay, for my conference paper today, I have to extend a big thank you to the Mari Sandoz Heritage Society for the 2020-2021 Sandoz Scholar Award. Not only did the Sandoz Scholar Award support my research for this paper specifically, but also a master's thesis at the University of Nebraska at Kearney, like Dr. Wenburg had said. I also need to express a great amount of appreciation for my thesis advisor, Dr. Christopher Steinke, for his feedback, expertise, and patience through this last year. Okay, and moving on to my conference paper. A powerful native nation, the Oglala Lakotas came on unprecedented times at the hands of the U.S. government in the early 1800s. Between stolen land, broken treaties, and impoverished conditions, their world changed forever by the beginning of the 20th century. Oglala territory encompassed most of the present-day South Dakota, parts of Wyoming, Montana, and Nebraska, with allies to the northeast and west that included the Cheyenne and Arapaho. With the European-based forces steadily advancing across the North American continent, by the 1850s, the Lakota found their land quickly encroached by non-native settlers seeking new social, economic, and political opportunities. As many of these first traders, explorers, pioneers, and settlers came farther west, native sovereignty came under fire. In the eyes of the U.S. federal government and the wave of non-native settlers, Red Cloud and Spotted Tail were in the way of Manifest Destiny ideals. U.S. policy regarding westward expansion were to remove, relocate, and segregate natives from the rest of the country so that Americans and other immigrants could take up the land for its resources. The Lakota were no different. And by 1904, all reservation territory in northwest Nebraska had been removed and open for public domain. My master's thesis examines roughly the first 50 years of non-native settlement in northwest Nebraska leading up to and after the Wounded Knee Massacre at Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, starting in the 1860s when the military established Camp Sheridan in Fort Robinson, and then ending in 1904 when President Roosevelt did away with the White Clay extension from Pine Ridge Agency, thus making Nebraska's role the focal point of this study. Much of the scholarship related to Nebraska and Pine Ridge connections have been largely neglected or overlooked. Historians like Jeffrey Ostler, Heather Cox Richardson, and others discuss the territory of Nebraska in great detail related to various military excursions and native removal, but there has been no comprehensive history about the impact of the nearby border towns and their relationship to the reservation in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It should also be stressed that this is not an entire history of northwest Nebraska. The communities in Sheridan and Dawes counties within 30 miles of Pine Ridge Indian Reservation are more strictly considered as it pertains to certain events, individuals, places, and spaces through a borderland narrative. Even then, most of the research conducted focused more on Gordon, Rushville, Hay Springs, and Chadron because they were the largest border towns right on the Missouri Valley and Elkhorn rail line and had the most to offer the agency regarding resources and social amenities. My paper today addresses the origins of non-native communities in northwest Nebraska and their ties to the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation across that Nebraska state line. As a result of several skirmishes and treaties signed in the 1860s, Native leaders Red Cloud and Spotted Tail were established in northwest Nebraska. From the start, their new home in northwest Nebraska did not bode well among Lakotas and Brule. Violence and grievances towards the U.S. military persisted. As a result of continued Native violence, General Philip Sheridan made orders to bring a large Sioux expedition of soldiers near both agencies that established Fort Robinson and Camp Sheridan. If necessary, troops could use military force to get the situation back under control. From Camp Sheridan's establishment in September of 1874, officer reports reclaim that most Native relations were relatively peaceful, but there were most definitely tensions between the military and the Brule. For example, not even a month after the new agency was established, Major Townsend reported a specific incident involving another beef issue. A herd of cattle from Texas sat out for the Spotted Tail Agency and contracted by Mr. Cunny and Ecafee stampeded through the night on September 18th. Having only found 42 of the cattle, Cunny and Ecafee filed a complaint that the 10 missing head of cattle were killed by the Brule. Their evidence being 6 hides traded with traders with the brand of Cunny and Ecafee contractors. Major Townsend was in fact so sure that the Brule had participated in the theft that he even named Owl Eagle as one of the culprits in the report. In addition, Townsend sent a request for punishment of Owl Eagle to the acting agent at Spotted Tail Agency, a Mr. E. Willard. After over a month of no reply from either Agent Willard or from Fort Laramie, Townsend prepared to dispatch soldiers and forcibly take back what was stolen. According to Townsend, this punishment was to show strength and prevent any such further theft. On October 21st, a change in tone from Townsend's report to Lieutenant Leonard Hay of the 9th Infantry described new plans going forward. Spotted Tail was to meet with Major Townsend in a couple of days' time to discuss how the issues were to be resolved. Finally, on October 28th, whether the Brule were responsible or not, Spotted Tail agreed to pay for damages from withholding 10 cattle from their annuities. The tipping point in removing both agencies out of Nebraska involved non-native settlers illegally trading through native territory to the Black Hills. In one of Major Townsend's last reports to Lieutenant Hay, most of his efforts to keep non-natives out of the regions were failing. The Gordon Party, A.C. Gay, and many other miners penetrated into the Black Hills. With the lack of success in policing the region by the U.S. military, Spotted Tail promised that had nothing been done, they would handle the situation themselves, thus putting General Sheridan in a difficult position to either uphold the treaties with Red Cloud and Spotted Tail or defend Americans from being slaughtered. Ultimately, both Lakota and Brule would be forced out of the state of Nebraska by the end of 1878 and open for non-native settlers. When most non-native settlers first came to the region, they did not have much of an economic or social interest in the nearby Pine Ridge Agency or the reservation in the early 1880s. Leaders like Reverend Scammahorn, Levi Sweat were more strictly focused on the fact that the new territory was open for settlement, suitable for agriculture, and the new opportunities being first in the region. Scammahorn, Sweat, and those who followed them knew the Ogallala were only 20 to 30 miles north, but the federal government's policy to segregate natives and non-natives as much as possible did not make it seem so economical being near the reservation. If anything, the native territory prevented more settlers from coming to the region, so more locals wanted the land open for public domain instead. That, of course, being said, the two exceptions were the large cattle enterprises and illegal trading taking place between natives and non-natives. The Newman and Hunter and Evans ranches secured beef contracts for the nearby Rosebud and Pine Ridge agencies, as well as the 2 military encampments. Most of this business was between agency agents or military officials who then conducted the rest of the business in dispersing rations. As for the largely unorganized non-native traders living near the White Clay River, only 200 feet across the reservation border, had far more negative effects on the reservation. Non-native settlers near the border purposely sought business with natives seeking whiskey, guns, ammunition, and other contraband. For the newly appointed agent at Pine Ridge Agency in 1878, Valentine McKilligutty, reported that being so close to the Nebraska border meant that the Ogallala generally congregated and lived with only a few miles around the agency. When natives came to get their annuities and rations, they only had to trek a little over a mile south to acquire contraband. With his hands tied and not able to enforce Indian laws off the reservation, Agent McGillicuddy proposed a neutral zone in Nebraska to prevent further illegal trades, establishing a barrier on the northern edge of Nebraska between the Oglala and, quote, white inhabitants who occupied the land just south of the border, end quote, could slow down some of the problems. On July 29, 1880, McGillicuddy advised the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, Roland Trowbridge, of the severity of the situation at the Nebraska border. Quote, the state of affairs will result sooner or later in serious trouble as a protection to the superintendent, the Indians, and the agent. I would suggest that the department secure the zoning zone aside by executive order of a strip of land in Nebraska immediately adjacent to the line 5 miles wide, north and south, and 10 miles east and west. Said piece of land to be settled up only under the supervision of the department. The Office of Indian Affairs moved forward with McGillicuddy's request. However, the Secretary of Interior, Charles Shrews, rejected the plan. Shrews claimed that a neutral zone would strictly favor licensed trader on Pine Ridge and deter trading in Nebraska. As Shrews' argument started to gain favor among politicians and the public, McGillicuddy had to make a strong case with startling examples of illegal activity. Instead of admitting defeat, the Pine Ridge Agency exposed the illegal trading of liquor that was literally taking place roughly 300 feet south of the Nebraska line. One such trading store commonly sold extract ginger as an intoxicating liquor, while another one, who owned by James Wood, sold nearly 100 gallons of whiskey during the month of December in 1880. Despite the overwhelming evidence, McGillicuddy made an effort to garner more political support by making a compromise. The recommended 5 by 10 mile buffer zone in Nebraska was not to infringe on free trade, but rather to limit and restrict the illegal contraband coming onto the reservation by a simple request to the agency. On the other hand, Shrews firmly believed that the reservation system should dissolve and assimilate all natives into mainstream American society. At the time, no new promising sites led to the desired buffer zone. And finally, by 1882, the OIA had finally a new opportunity to get an executive order passed under a new presidential administration. With President Chester Arthur now in office, the Secretary of Interior, Samuel Kirkwood, gave up his seat in the Senate to be on the president's cabinet. While only a few months in office, Kirkwood came across a letter on his desk early on that described the situation at Pine Ridge Agency and in Nebraska. With the recommendation by the OIA and the agency agent, Kirkwood recommended that the president also give his stamp of approval. The language in the executive order allowed for the withdrawal of the land from public settlement at the pleasure of the president. In the description, the executive order, quote, provided that the said tract of land in the state of Nebraska shall be reserved by executive order only so long as it may be needed for the use and protection of the Indians receiving rations and annuities at Pine Ridge Agency, end quote. And as a result of this buffer zone, the success was nearly instant. McGillicuddy's first annual report reflected that there was little to no trouble involving liquor. In addition to the significant drop in illegal activity, the reservation could be effectively policed and regulated with the Nebraska border south. For now, the Great Sioux Reservation extended into Nebraska by only a few miles on its northern border, thus limiting non-native and native interactions to a minimum. As more news reached further east that this northwest Nebraska region was suitable for American life, larger droves of people came into the spring of 1884. Valentine U.S. Land Commissioner Judge Tucker heavily promoted the newly opened free land opportunities. In his glowing reports, the relatively unsettled land west of Valentine made for an attractive space for a colony of pioneers. Plus, rumor had it that the rail line leading to Valentine was possibly going to be expanded in the coming year or two. At an Indiana exposition in 1883, Reverend John Scammahorn and his wife Mary happened to have found themselves speaking with Judge Tucker. Not only did Tucker describe the openness and opportunities of settling in Nebraska, but convinced the Scammahorns and friends to visit the area a few months later. Having been persuaded, The Civil War veteran and Methodist preacher led over a dozen families and 100 people to the Antelope Valley in May of 1884. In the following year, Scammahorn convinced another wave of colonists to come with James Croter from Indiana to continue to bring more people. At the same time, several other colonists sought the Bordeaux Valley. According to the Chadron, Nebraska Centennial History, the large swath of settlement in present-day Dawes County came when there was a heightened interest in the land following the news of the continuation of the Missouri Valley and Elkhorn Rail Line in 1884. Prominent ranches in and around Sioux County, including the Half Diamond E, Sioux City Cattle Company, and many others, were already well established for a few years in supplying beef issues to the nearby Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. However, there was no formally established communities. Levi Sweat from Northwest Missouri led a party of more than 20 individuals and families to Valentine on April 6, 1884. Among these early colonists, Ed Egan, an aspiring young journalist, took a more northern route, quote, over a reservation road through Pine Ridge to avoid the trek through the sandhills further south, end quote. He also recalled how important the first settling colony in the region was going to dictate the future. As more rumors circulated about the continuation of the rail line in northwest Nebraska, many other immigrants from the east quickly settled in the region between the two colonies. In Rush Valley, 1 mile north of present-day Rushville, Henry Crow, James Loughborough, and John Baer attained their homestead and timber claims just adjacent to one another. Between these three men and their families, they established the first store and post office in Rush Valley region for settlers to come this way. By July 3rd, 1884, there were many farmers and ranchers scattered all around the Rush Valley that relied on the established general store and post office. Then about 15 miles west of Rush Valley is the Pleasant Valley. Hay was abundant in the region that made for a great stopping point for livestock, thus why Hay Springs was founded. The quickly growing communities of Gordon, Rushville, Hay Springs, and Chadron would soon be incorporated in 1885 and break off from the Sioux County and form their own county, Dawes and Sheridan counties. Though these bordering towns grew largely independent of the reservation and solely took advantage of the open land available. But by the spring of 1886, the potential profits for settlers being near the reservation were realized and started to materialize financially. Rumors circulated around the area that the agency and military officials were considering moving the Indian depot that supplied various annuities and beef issues from Gordon. As a result of these rumored discussions, the already heated Rushville and Gordon rivalry that competed for the county seat was renewed. On April 3rd, a brief article in the Rushville Standard titled "The Supply Depot" detailed how Rushville residents were receiving word through railroad reports that the Gordon Indian Supply Depot would be relocated to Rushville. To further back up the claim, a General Armstrong from Washington, D.C. came to Rushville to examine, quote, the route from this place to Pine Ridge Agency and also from Gordon to that place, end quote. In doing so, General Armstrong measured by section lines as a precursor for, quote, when the country becomes well settled and the farms fenced, end quote. In addition to these calculations, special consideration included which route had more navigable creeks and rivers to and from the future supply depot. Following his survey of the two distances, the Standard reported that Armstrong favored the Rushville route over the Gordon one. From this news, Gordon and Rushville residents continued their rivalry. For both of these communities, it was the future opportunity in the coming years and more of a political say in future native and non-native relations that made the supply depot such a big deal. Rushville officially had the Indian Supply Depot by May of 1886 and left Gordon feeling cheated from not only the depot, but also the county seat that it thought it rightfully deserved. As a last effort to console Gordon residents, the Standard reiterated that even though Rushville was geographically more situated to be the logical choice for the depot, the business never amounted to much, and only a few traders and freighters directly benefited from its new location. Beyond just the freighting business from the Indian Supply Depot to the agency and loose trading around the border, there was also a growing interest in native expositions in Nebraska and around the globe. The earliest fascination in native culture among Northwest Nebraska residents came through the beef issues at the agency. On November 5th, 1885, a large number of Rushville citizens and residents from other nearby communities attended the beef issue. The article in the Rushville Standard was brief, however, expressed that there was some kind of performance that made for an entertaining afternoon for folks who watched from afar. And then again, on June of 1886 and March of 1887, the Pine Ridge agency officials sent a special invitation to locals who wanted to see the large beef issue. Nearly 50 residents, Rushville residents, both men and women, made the journey north to watch what was made out to be a performance and a spectacle. As a result of these widely attended Native performances at Pine Ridge, there were special occasions when Nebraska residents invited their Native neighbor to do the same in Nebraska. One of the largest celebrations that invited Native dancers and performers off the reservation and into Nebraska was during the Chadron 4th of July celebrations in 1886 and 1887. In a reprinted article in the Chadron Record that was originally from the Chadron Democrat, the first 4th of July had a major Native presence from Pine Ridge. Chief Red Cloud arrived to the outskirts of town on July 2nd with special invitation from the 4th of July Reception Committee. Once given the all-clear, quote, hundreds of mounted warriors dressed in all variety of costumes peculiar to Indians and chanting their wild monotonous songs, end quote, came into the city limits. Chief Red Cloud, smoking a cigar in an open carriage, came strolling into town with his wife and small children. Following Red Cloud came several more wagons, pack ponies, travois that were to set up camp southeast of town. The Chadron Democrat then recorded that, quote, after passing through the principal streets of the city, they immediately raised a city of their own, consisting of many tall, white lodges, end quote. Then several Chadron citizens were appointed to load up various provisions of food while they were visiting. As news continued to spread about the Native performance in northwest Nebraska border towns, Buffalo Bill found himself a frequent visitor and recruiter in the area for his Wild West shows. When Buffalo Bill started his Wild West shows in May of 1884, they quickly gained in popularity for those in the East who had little to no contact with natives. In preparation for his 1887 European exposition, Buffalo Bill wanted the Wild West show to be bigger and better, with careful attention to detail about who he hired as native actors and how much he paid them. His choice of soliciting native actors from Pine Ridge was predominantly because of the more well-known skirmishes and the fact that the newly established Missouri Valley and Elkhorn rail line was only 24 miles directly south of the Pine Ridge Agency. Thus, made it relatively easy for Buffalo Bill to contract natives just across the border and send them to Omaha via train in Rushville. Of these actors, John Neihart in Black Elk Speaks highlighted Black Elk's brief journey south to Rushville to board the train. Another prominent native actor in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, Chief Redshirt, wrote back about his own experiences. A leader on the reservation, a frequent visitor to Rushville, and a friend to many non-natives in the region, Redshirt wrote to a non-native friend at the agency about his travels in May of 1887. From his letter, a Mr. Robinson then shared the news with the Rushville Standard for a brief report about the show across the Atlantic. Dated May 2nd from London, England, Redshirt described 15 days of sea travel and seasickness. At the time, Redshirt and many of the other actors were still resting from the journey. They had done little to no work and were simply getting ready for their first show on the 9th. In 1887, Buffalo Bill was contracted for nearly 300 shows across the United States and Europe. This same success continued through 1888 and 1889. However, acquiring native actors from Pine Ridge came to a screeching halt the summer of 1890. By the last decade of the 19th century and the first few years of 1900, the Indian scares of 1890 and the Wounded Knee Massacre drastically changed local native and non-native relations. During the summer of 1890, many local and newspaper accounts of the Indian scares related to a native messiah and the ghost dance that brought forth some major changes between native and non-native interactions. Trading was cut off, and only a limited few citizens were allowed to go north to the reservation. The U.S. military from Fort Robinson established a soldiers' camp in Rushville with telegraph wires built north towards the agency in case more troops were needed. Local Nebraska residents downplayed the severity of the situation to continue encouraging non-native immigrants to the region, but thoroughly enjoyed the economic boom with the increased military presence. Then finally, on December 29th, 1890, the Wounded Knee Massacre started a fundamental societal change in how non-natives viewed their native neighbor at Pine Ridge. As described by many of the locals through their children or grandchildren, many Nebraskans in Sheridan and Dawes County fled to Fort Robinson or hunkered down in large groups in town, fearful of retaliation. From Northwest Nebraskans in the late 19th century, the Wounded Knee Massacre was not a massacre, but a battle between American soldiers and, quote, uncivilized Indians. In a direct response to the events that unfolded at Wounded Knee, several local militias formed to defend the community. Specifically in Hay Springs, the Mosser Guards consisted of 50 men at the ready following the battle. Citizen soldiers regularly drilling and conducting target practice remained an informal regiment routine that assembled whenever an Indian scare was widely feared. Rushville and Gordon did the same. To Nebraskans, this battle was a direct attack from Bigfoot's band who sought to join the hostile Oglala's dancing in Pine Ridge. Prior to 1890, many Nebraska locals, knowing most of the officials at Pine Ridge Agency and the military who protected them, had little doubt about the military reports at Wounded Knee. So they had little reason to not believe their friends and military protectors. Instead, residents in border towns in Dawes and Sheridan counties believe this failure has more to do with the federal government than anything else. According to them, the military might have done the best they could with all the ghost dancing, lack of annuities, and dispelling the renowned feelings of native sovereignty. However, this was a result of government failure to assimilate natives on Pine Ridge. Instead of politicians and federal officials in the East, Nebraska residents firmly believed that in order to assimilate native people at Pine Ridge, it was to be through the locals in the nearby communities off the reservation. Various businessmen and women strongly asserted that they knew best how to help. With more and more influence, the local influence in Pine Ridge Indian affairs, and the last of the native territory in northwest Nebraska was removed in 1904 by Teddy Roosevelt. Thus, further cemented the influence Nebraska would have on the reservation for many more years to come. Thank you.
So thank you to Broc for that wonderful, wonderful presentation. We are honored to have you representing the Sandoz Scholar for this past year. So with that, what questions do we have for Broc? Good, because I wrote some down, but I knew Shannon would have some. Wonderful. So we'll have Shannon take our first question.
So Broc, is your research going to start a little before and go a little after what you're doing here? Because I'm really interested in the gold seekers that ended up really starting Gordon and everything like that. But very few people have really talked about what you just were hinting at the very end during the ghost dance era. And there were a lot of white settlers that knew that this wasn't a threat to them and stayed in their sod houses up there. And so I'm really interested in you finding some of that history. And I just wondered how far into the 1900s you thought you would go.
So most of what my research is going to go toward is just the end of the Nebraska territory from the White Clay Extension being removed from Pine Ridge Agency. In fact, because this is only a small part of everything that I talk about in my thesis, there was a judge in Sheridan County that had called for the removal of that extension, and I think you kind of talked about it a little bit yesterday with the some of the legal aspects that this is not rightfully belonging to the reservation or in the federal government's hand. It belongs to the state of Nebraska when it's incorporated and all those 9 yards. So that's kind of focus there with that emphasis on space. But there's definitely that transition that follows the Wounded Knee Massacre, as if before there was that segregation between natives and non-natives, and then it was opened up for the locals to take on that prominent role to assimilate people at Pine Ridge.
I'm excited.
I know.
Congratulations. You've
Thank
done
you.
a great job.
Don't congratulate me yet. I have yet to defend it.
When is your defense?
I hope in December, maybe January, right, Dr. Sankey?
It's coming.
It's coming sooner than later.
We'll go to you, sir.
Thanks, Brock. Great talk. Dave Nesham here, Chadron State College. Just a quick question on White Clay Creek and then White Clay continuing on into the 21st century. What have you found about the White Clay Creek and that specific little spot as far as continuing to be an issue or not being what's the role of White Creek, I guess I would say?
So and it's not I want to emphasize that this is not an exceptional experience being near the border of Pine Ridge Indian Agency. I mean, before, Spotted Tail was located at Whetstone Agency further east in South Dakota, north of Fort Randall, and they had a heck of a time with trying to make sure non-native settlers weren't trading whiskey, guns, ammunition, you name it. And so what's kind of unique about the whole White Clay extension, though, is the fact that certain individuals were allowed to live off of the land as long as they had a permit or had permission through the agency. So they were either contracted through the agency or were under close supervision. So even though it was set aside as an extension for the reservation as a whole, there were still individuals, non-native and settlers, still living on that territory. So, and I think I try to alluded to some of the problems that were going to happen in the 21st century with the focus on liquor and intoxicating drinks with the White Clay beer stores that were happening all throughout the later part of the 1900s and early 2000s. So, but I don't know if I answered your question in entire.
It sounds like there was government approval in some ways of the White Clay?
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. Government approval for non-native settlers living in that 5 by 10 mile zone as a whole. But it was more of a having control of what was going on further south, so that way with the agency just right there, they could police the region more effectively and make sure contraband wasn't getting in the wrong hands, according to them.
Go to James.
I'm very unfamiliar with the history of the region, so forgive me for asking this question if it's a stupid question, but did that exclusion zone ever reform at any point in time? It seems like even on contemporary maps sometimes there's like an idea that the reservation hangs down into Nebraska territory. Do you know anything about that? Or is that just like a relic of the map making process from the 19th century or something? Well, I guess the ultimate question is there a portion of the agency that does still to this day hang down into Nebraska?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay. It just seems like I've seen images
Right.
on maps where that is the suggestion, which I just find fascinating.
Yeah, and even today, a lot of locals will refer to it as the what do I want to say? Not the agency. Extension, yeah. Thank you, Shannon. I appreciate that. She knows it more than I do for sure about that whole part there. And she also knows about the Gordon and Rushville rivalry that still happens to this day. It hasn't gotten better with the consolidated schools. It's just, and it stems back from the very beginning with the courthouse being moved and the Indian supply in Gordon that was moved to Rushville. Ultimately, most of that native business is going through Rushville, but Gordon really feels cheated out of the whole situation. Sorry, Mom and Dad, my Gordon residents. Yeah.
So I have a follow-up question for Brock. You alluded to your larger work. Could you just tell the audience a little bit more about how this piece, what we heard today, fits into your larger arc of your master's thesis and what your overall argument then is, how it all works together?
So yeah, a lot of my thesis looks at the before, and like I mentioned in the title of this presentation is Before and After Wounded Knee. There is a key transition that transpires that is following, the U.S. military role of displacing and relocating and segregating red cloud and spotted tail out of Nebraska and away from non-native settlers that then comes to a major change when Wounded Knee and the Indian scares that had gone on. And I want to emphasize the Indian scares that I'm using in quotes that many of the locals used was not just one singular event. It was always a fear between 1890 and it seems like 1895 or even into the 1896. So there was always this fear of native retaliation, this uprising, if you will, that never led to any kind of fruition. And so the locals, which part of my chapter 3 and the ending of my thesis, takes a step back and looks, well, the federal government is not doing this right. The military reports and the officials that we have are saying all these things that aren't going quite the way that it's supposed to, so it should be up to us in trying to assimilate those native peoples up on Pine Ridge. And so that's where you start to see the beginnings of all of these teachers, health professionals, people going up north to take on a role that people in the east had recently done. And so there's even advertisements in the Rushville Standard and the Gordon Journal in the late 1890s, early 1900s for locals to come up to the reservation and be part of this change to assimilate natives and those that were involved with the ghost dancing and all of the stuff that had happened prior in the 1860s and 1870s, because those recollections were a big part of that identity among Native people, and for the perspective of non-natives and how they seen their Native neighbor. Hopefully that answered it a little bit.
You did, and good luck at your defense. Any other questions before we wrap up this session? All right, let's give him a final round of applause, please. Thank you, Broc.